So he sings in heaven and on the earth and makes the worse argument stronger. You cover it down, I understand, I guess, I believe, I hope, because we're moving on. After he establishes those, and essentially he says to the jury, this is what you called me, and I want to show you why you're wrong, he now has to show why they're wrong. And his way of doing it is to sort of give a little autobiographical sketch of how he got to be a philosopher. There's an old movie, old black and white movie, one of my favorite movies, North by Northwest, a Hitchcock movie, with Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint. And Eva Marie Saint plays sort of a triple agent, sort of a turncoat back and forth, and rather interesting role. And Cary Grant plays Cary Grant. That's the only thing he ever played in his whole life. Just played different versions of himself. But he got to a point where he just couldn't sort of stand all the double crossing, and said to her, I can't remember what her name is, how does a girl like you get to be a girl like you? Well, that's what Socrates is saying to the jury. He's telling him, I'm going to tell you how a girl like me got to be a girl like me. Or maybe he would have said it slightly differently than that, but I think that sounds sort of nice, almost androgynous sounding thing. But philosophers need to sort of explain how they became philosophers, because being a philosopher is not the ordinary thing. Someone who makes a life of being a philosopher and really eschews Gesundheit, eschews Gesundheit, gives up other parts of his life and really sort of concentrates on philosophy. Almost, we always feel compelled to explain why we're so different from everyone else. And that's sort of what Socrates is trying to do here. Because a lot of what he was being accused of really came down for him sort of walking to the beat of a different drummer, having a view of the world that was different from the conformist view that everybody was expected to have. And so he was in some sense expected to sort of explain why he is different. And he comes up and says that sort of, they're at about 20C4, the beginning of that new paragraph in your edition. One of you might perhaps interrupt me and say, but Socrates, what is your occupation? For where have these slanders come? For surely if you did not busy yourself with something out of the common, all these rumors and talk would not have arisen unless you did something other than most people. Tell us what it is, that we may not speak inadvisedly about you. So, of course, everyone knows he's a philosopher. We all know the philosophers study things in the heaven and under the earth and these other kinds of things. So he's sort of saying, rhetorically, you might be asking me, how did you come to become a philosopher? Because after all, this is a little weird, a little strange, a little bit something out of the ordinary, and it requires an explanation of you. And so he doesn't believe, and as I don't believe, that being a philosopher needs to be alibied. You know, you don't have to explain to people why you're a philosopher. But he recognizes he's talking to ordinary people who have an ordinary and commonplace view of things. And they're also holding his life in their hands. And so he believes that he has to explain why he is the different person he is. And maybe that explanation will have enough of maybe ring enough sympathy in them that they'll accept it. So he's sort of saying, okay, I'll try to do that. And he says that, well, the best place to cut to is about 21A. He says, you all remember Chaerephon. Chaerephon was a friend of Socrates, a long time, sort of a buddy. He was dead at that point, of course. He had died well before Socrates, but several of Socrates' friends had been around for a long time. Crito, who we will meet in the next dialogue, is another one of his boyhood friends that had hung around forever and ever. And Chaerephon was one of those friends as well. It turns out probably sometime in Socrates' middle to late 20s, it began to become noticed more and more by people, not just his friend, but a lot of people in Athens, that he was a really smart guy. And he was extremely smart. This is really before he became sort of the systematic philosopher that he was about to become. But everybody knew, first of all, he had an interest in philosophy, and he was just smarter than anybody they'd ever met. And it finally got to the point of people beginning to ask in his inner circle, the people who hung out with, like Chaerephon and Crito, Critias, Charmides, or people like that, who've been around him for a long time, and said, I'll bet he's the smartest guy in the world. And it's sort of almost like a bar bet, where I'll bet I can name the first 16 presidents of the United States, spelling their names backwards and drinking a beer at the same time, those kinds of things. And there's bets as to whether you can do it or not. And you go, Lincoln, never did that the way I did. So the important thing is there seemed to be some sort of a thought that maybe he's the smartest guy in the world. But then the immediate question became, how do we know? How can we find this out? Well, that's what gods are for. And so the thought was, if we're going to find out whether anyone's wiser than Socrates, let's go ask the god of wisdom, who was Apollo. Now, luckily, the god of wisdom, Apollo, was also one of the gods of the city of Athens. Remember, the gods of the city, and then the new gods that Socrates is accused of inventing. Well, luckily, one of the gods of the city was Apollo. He was the god of wisdom, and so it seemed natural to go and ask Apollo. Now, you don't get down on your knees and pray, oh dear Apollo, please tell me, is Socrates the wisest guy in the world? Instead, you go to the temple of Apollo, you take a few drachmas with you, some money, and then you pay for the privilege of having an oracle, which in this case was a woman who claimed that she could speak to Apollo directly. To have the oracle ask Apollo, and then she'd go into a trance and sort of speak in tongues and drool a lot. And then when she came out of it, she would go and say, this is what Apollo said to me. And then you get your answer and you go home, minus a few drachmas, but at least you have probably an authoritative word on whatever the question was. Will I have any more kids? Will there be a, will my son get into the University of Athens? Will it be a good crop? Whatever it can be. And so they decide, we got to ask Apollo whether anybody's wiser than Socrates, anybody in the world. So Chaerephon is one who was sort of appointed to do it. He goes, pays his money. The priests take the money. They don't give the money to the woman. She just gets a chance to talk to Apollo. And that's an interesting thing because, of course, nobody really knows whether she talked to Apollo. Of course, nobody really probably believes at this point that there was such a person as Apollo. So that, she had a good scam going. But the interesting thing was, she was one of the most powerful women in Athens. And the reason she was a powerful woman, one of the most powerful women, powerful by which I mean, she had a steady job and no man would mess with her. And the reason for that was that they weren't sure that she was telling, she might be telling the truth. Maybe Apollo did speak to her directly. And they messed with Apollo's messenger. They messed with Apollo. Apollo will hit them in places they don't ever want to be hit again. And so they decided, we'll just let her do her thing and we'll rake in the money and she'll give all of these phony fortune-telling things or whatever it happens to be. It was a nice little carnival act. But it was very serious to everybody in Athens. It was serious to Chaerephon, and it was serious to Socrates as well. And so they went there, it happened, and finally she came back and said, here's what Apollo says, no one is wiser than Socrates. So, and no one is later than Casey. That's another thing that Apollo said. No one is wiser than Socrates, no one is later than Casey. No one is hungrier than Casey. Apollo was not really that hungry at all because he was non-physical being. So no one is wiser than Socrates. Chaerephon thought, great! He goes home, tells everybody, everybody's saying, all right, high five all around. Except for one person, Socrates. Socrates is not celebrated. Socrates says, that ain't right. That's not, it can't be true. And so Socrates was caught in a dilemma, and it's a dilemma made by the gods to a certain extent. Those are the worst kind of dilemmas. Human dilemmas you can sort of deal with in your own way. But here's what Socrates had. This really became, you might say, the driving force of him becoming a philosopher was this dilemma he was left with. And the dilemma was this. The gods say, no one's wiser than Socrates. Now, as he says this in a few lines there, it's not right for the gods to lie. The gods always tell the truth. So I know that on the surface, this is true. No one is wiser than Socrates. But he says, I also know something else. I know from my own self-knowledge, I don't know anything. In fact, when he talks about, a little before that, talks about, he sort of thought to have a certain kind of wisdom. He always denied he had a certain kind of wisdom or any kind of wisdom at all because his idea of what counted as wisdom and what counted as knowledge worth knowing were knowledge of the big issues, the big things like what is the nature of justice or truth, what is compassion, what is courage, those kinds of things. To him, those are the most important things to know, and he didn't know any of them. Really didn't even think he had a starting point. Now, he didn't mean he didn't know anything. He knew his name. He knew how to find his way home. He knew how to avoid picking up a check in the restaurant. He knew all those kinds of things. But he thought these are just sort of just extra stuff. If you've watched The Death of Socrates, the video I put up, and probably cried your eyes out at the end there with Steve Martin dying a sad and horrible death. One thing you'll notice that after he sort of chug-a-lugs down the hemlock, he gets told, surprisingly to him, that hemlock is poisonous. And he said, I didn't know hemlock was poisonous. I don't know details, he says. And that sort of, really, that was something of a very, that was funny. It was something that Socrates might have been. I mean, he may, he was not interested in these little details. He was interested in the big issues of justice and knowledge, etc. And poisonous, I don't know what the hell is poisonous in there. He drinks it down, and that was it. By the way, Steve Martin and I go way back to the point that we've never met. That's how far back we go. Steve Martin was a philosophy major in California when I was a philosophy major in California. He went to Cal State Long Beach, same time, we're about the same age. He went to Cal State Long Beach about the same time I was in Cal State Dominguez Hills, which is our neighboring campuses. Dominguez Hills is sort of outside of Carson, south of Compton, east of Redondo Beach. I live in Redondo Beach, and of course Cal State Long Beach. It's in Long Beach, which is rather south and west of that area. So we didn't know each other, of course, but we were both philosophy majors at the same time. And the thing, I feel happy I've used my philosophical education. I feel good about who I am, what I am, but I feel really bad about poor Martin. I don't know what's really become of him, but he could have made something of himself because he dropped out of school. He dropped out of college before he finished his degree in philosophy. He never got a bachelor's degree. Actually, they awarded him a pity degree later in his life. They awarded him a bachelor's degree in philosophy because they just took pity on the poor bastard. And he's just I don't know what he just dropped out of school. Who knows what became of him? Just a real failure, frankly. And I feel very strongly about how much I've made of my life, especially when compared with somebody like what's his name, Martin. So it's too bad. But so he has a certain amount of knowledge of, let's say, maybe a little bit of Socrates, a great deal of knowledge of the absurd. I think he is a good philosopher in the sense that he has an always immediate touch with the absurd. I think every philosopher that is a good philosopher must have a healthy respect and even an embrace and love of the absurd. Because if you get too, you either love the absurd or you put your head in the oven. Those are the only two kinds of philosophers there are. Dead philosophers before their time, and ones who can embrace the absurd. Yes, you absurd person, Mr. Garcia, you.
Are you referencing the same absurd that Camus talked about?
Hmm?
Are you talking about the same absurdity that Camus talked about?
Oh, yeah, I think, yeah.
I was just wondering if that's what you know.
But I mean absurd in the way Camus meant it, but also I mean absurd in the way you might say it would be said today. And sort of because I think there's a link between the two. I think there's a link. I mean, Camus' view of the absurd has much more sort of depth of character in it. And no one ever accused Steve Martin of having a depth of character, except me. I like the guy.
But than Erasmus' idea of the absurd.
Erasmus?
Erasmus.
Oh, I thought you said harassment. I said, well, he's not harassing me by telling me I'm absurd. That's okay. Oh,
That's
Erasmus.
more like our idea of absurd, like if he bred the embrace of folly.
Okay. Yeah, Erasmus. Okay. But I like Camus better because he drank good wine. Died in a car wreck, just like Jimmy Dean. So, not the bacon guy. The rebel without a cause. So, how far have we got? Is this far enough so we can leave now? No, okay, let's continue on with Socrates talking about the fact that it can't possibly be the case that he is the wisest person in the world because he knows personally he knows nothing. So this dilemma arises between what the God said, which must be right, but Socrates believes he knows himself pretty well, and he has been starting to live the examined life, and therefore his examination of his life says, I don't know much of anything. The gods are saying, no one's wiser than you. There's a conflict here that has to be resolved. Now, there's an interesting line that Socrates says here at about 21b. Consider that I tell you this because I would inform you about the origin of the slander. Now, the slander he's talking about is sort of the slander that he is a wise person. And a part of the wise person slander I'll talk about a little bit later when he starts talking about the interrogation he starts engaging in with famous people. But for right now, when he's talking about the slander, it's the slander of being wise, of having all this knowledge, which he knows he doesn't. And he has been denying it from the very beginning. He's going to try to deny it again. Because often, I think I've mentioned before, that there was in this time, particularly during the democracy, during the resurgence of the democracy, particularly the return of the democracy after the 30 tyrants were deposed in that little revolution that occurred after the end of the Peloponnesian War, when the democracy was restored, there was a lot of sort of intellectual, anti-intellectual feeling within the populace. The populace felt that smart people led them astray, led them into this terrible war. The war had been a disaster. They had lost to Sparta. That there are a whole lot of reasons why we need to distrust intellectuals and deal, only us good, solid people of the earth are the ones who really know enough.
I'm just curious, what made them blame the smart people? What did democracy turn inward when they went to war with
Well, look at our world today, our American society, and ask if the democracy is not built upon the kind of pig-headed ignorance that often reared its head. So back to, but it was what? It was true that they had a great distrust of intellectuals, and Socrates was most prominent of the intellectuals. And so a part of one interpretation of why this trial came to be, there's a lot of sort of converging interpretations, is essentially make him the scapegoat of all intellectuals. All intellectuals have been the problem with this country. Let's weed them out, and let's get the most prominent one and kill him. We can kill the most prominent one through this trial, officially, Athens is killing him. It's not just some lone, because it wouldn't be a gunman back in those days. What would be a lone swordsman or wielding a chalice of hemlock, assassinating him, whatever it would be. They wanted it to be a show that the democracy, or the jury speaking for the democracy speaking for Athens, repudiates you. And once you're dead, and you are, in some sense, the placeholder or the representative or the symbol of the intellectual life that they felt they could no longer trust and maybe have been wrong to trust for so long. So that's a part of a pretty compelling interpretation of how Socrates, or why Socrates got to be at the trial. Well, he is still trying to explain how a girl like him got to be a girl like him, and he said, when I heard of this reply, I asked myself, whatever it is that God means, what is his riddle? Now, that question, what is his riddle, is a very important question, because there was a tradition, particularly with Apollo, but with most of the oracles, because lots of other oracles would be there for different other gods in their temples. But the oracle at Delphi was a part, actually a northern suburb, you might say, of Athens. And Delphi, where the cave was, where the oracle stayed, and the temple was built adjacent to the cave, the oracle at Delphi was the most famous and most probably powerful and respected and listened to oracle, fortune teller, etc., in all of Athens. And so when this oracle speaks, it is presumed to be the voice of the gods. And so he says, what was the riddle that God was saying? Because the tradition was that when, particularly Apollo, gave an answer to a question, it would really have two levels. At the surface, it would be a true answer. No one's wiser than Socrates. I mean, it's literally true. But it was thought that that answer would be phrased in such a way as to open up other questions. That there's a deeper and more profound answer underneath that the gods are trying to get you to follow, trying to lead you toward the more profound answer, but willing if you just accept the superficial. That's okay. Accept the one on the surface, that's fine. It's going to be true. But if you really want to know what the gods are telling you, you have to look for what's hidden beneath it. That's why Socrates is saying, what was his riddle? Because he recognized by tradition, Apollo wouldn't just answer truthfully, he would, but he would also answer with something of a conundrum, something that would, if you really wanted to find out something more than just the factual basis for his answer, you would have to look deeper, deep in yourself and the meaning of the God's words. And so that's sort of what he is saying here. I'm very conscious that I am not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? For surely he does not lie. It's not legitimate for him to do so. And so he is stuck with this dilemma of trying to say, first of all, there has to be some way to resolve it. I mean, that's one thing he wants to do. He can't just live with the dilemma. He has to find a way to resolve it so that he can understand it. And he believes that the riddle, the hidden meaning behind what the God said, is the key to resolving it. But he has to find out what the hidden meaning is, so that's the problem. And he's not certain he knows how to do it himself. Again, if we're talking about the God of wisdom, who is Apollo, and he is already saying, Socrates, I don't have any wisdom, I don't know anything. He's saying essentially he's in a fight with no ammunition. He doesn't have any way of fathoming how deep Apollo wants him to go to answer the question, and he didn't have the resources either. So he's really worried about that. But then he had an idea. He said, maybe one thing I can do is I can find somebody who is wiser than me. And he assumed that there would be a whole lot of people in Athens wiser than him. And then he would sort of take this person, go back to the oracle and say, look, talk to my pal Apollo and say, look, found a guy wiser than me. He said I was the wisest. What gives? Then the oracle would go ask Apollo. Apollo would presumably come back with the hidden answer. With the answer, this is why I said this, Socrates, is because blah, 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 blah. So that was his plan. Find somebody wiser than him, take him back to the oracle, have the oracle quiz Apollo. End of story. Go home and have a cold one. So that's sounds like a good deal, but we've got to wait for a few more minutes before I can justify us doing that. Well, I used to, when I flunked out of college the first time, I mentioned this before, when I flunked out of college the first time, it was great, when the Berlin Wall had been built. Berlin Wall had been built in the spring of my last semester. I didn't know it was going to be my last semester. The Berlin Wall, which of course was torn down before most of you were born, so I'm talking about ancient history, back in the time of the Peloponnesian War, when Socrates and I stood, elbow to elbow, fighting off the Spartans. But at the time the Berlin Wall was constructed, I'll tell you, we got time, because I said we have time. At the time the Berlin Wall was constructed, and then I got kicked out. They started. This was when the draft was in effect. They were drafting in my neighborhood at the age of 21 and a half. I was just a little short of 21, and I realized I had about 6 months to find a job or a deferment. I couldn't go back to college. I was kicked out. No college going in. And this was a little pissant school in Kentucky. It had a little music conservatory, really nice music conservatory. I played a lot of instruments, but still, they kicked my ass out. So I had to find a job to get me a deferment or marry some poor person, and nobody was dumb enough to do that. Pardon?
Why did you say you got kicked out?
What did I do? What?
Why? Why were you kicked out?
Why what?
Kicked out of college. Why were you kicked out?
Why was kicked out of college? I was a fuck up. Okay, there's maybe a gentler way to say it, and that is that I flunked out.
Oh.
Flunked out. I want you to. Were you here when I gave that public confession? Threw myself on my knees and cried and wept horribly.
I think I might have missed
That might have been a dream I had, but that doesn't matter. No, I did talk about being kicked out of school. I talked about how it took me 26 years to get my first degree. And we're not talking about black belt either. We're talking about the only belt I had was a brown belt. That's because that's because of bacon. Bacon is brown. So I was offered a job by Freddie Adams, who ran a funeral home. And he was a guy who had never married, had no offspring, didn't like any of his employees, and he was getting older, and he wanted somebody to hand the business over to, but had to be somebody who would apprentice with him, learn all the business of the trade of being a funeral director, or mortician, etc. And so he was going to offer me the job, which meant essentially a chunk of the business, very profitable business. And but he wanted me to go in, and he said, I got to find out. He and I talking. I knew Freddie for a long time. He was a family friend. He said, I got to know. I said, what do you got to know? I said, I got to know how you feel about touching dead bodies. I was like, almost 21 there. I said, I guess it's okay. And so we went in the back. And he rolled a couple of them out. And my career came to an end at that point. I literally didn't go close to it. It did, it weirded me out. And so he said, no hard feelings, Denny, but this is not a good thing for you. So then I joined the Air Force. But the interesting thing I was worried about after that, because Freddie remained a friend of the family for a long time, and every once in a while he would call over at my dad's house and say, hey, you guys home now? Okay, why don't you come over for a cold one? I always wondered what he meant. So I never went. I almost had a cold one there with Freddie, and that was enough. So anyway, back to, I don't know what that was about, except it was about 5 minutes. That's 5 minutes that we'll never get back again. That's pretty bad. Well, let's continue on about him eventually going on the search to find someone wiser than himself. And so he narrates it here. Narrates it very well, much better than I could do, so that's no surprise. This is at about 21 B6. B5. For a long time I was at a loss as to his meaning, and then I very reluctantly turned to some such investigation as this. I went to one of those reputed wise, thinking that there, if anywhere, I could refute the oracle and say to it, this man is wiser than I, but you said that I was. So, that was his plan. Then I examined this man. We're not talking about a medical examination here. Examined this man. There's no need for you to tell his name. He was one of our public men, obviously a famous person, someone who's well known to everybody there, a politician almost certainly, one of our public men. My experience was something like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. Now, what he's sort of saying, and he'll say this in different ways throughout the rest of his little narrative, is that most people's reputation for wisdom is self-generated. That it's not the acclaim of others that sort of starts you on the path to wisdom. It's you sort of wanting to get that reputation and sort of being a self-promoter. At least that seemed to be his experience, that most of the people who had a reputation for wisdom had a reputation that pretty well was, as I said, sort of self-generated. And it didn't seem to have a whole lot of substance. Then I tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but he was not. As a result, he came to dislike me, and so did many of the bystanders. Now, if this is not an innocent abroad, I don't know, he's saying, oh, I handed him his ass, and he doesn't like me. How could that be? I mean, wonderful. So I withdrew and thought to myself, I'm wiser than this man. It's likely neither of us knows anything worthwhile. And I've talked about what counts as worthwhile. The great issues of existence, the great issues of human life, the issues of justice and courage and beauty, of love, those kinds of things. What is in their nature? Piety. He says that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, he says, but he thinks he knows something when he doesn't. When I do not know, neither do I think I know. So I'm likely to be wiser than he to this small extent that I do not think I know what I do not know. So for him, that tended to be, at least at the surface, a vindication of the oracle. The oracle saying no one's wiser than Socrates. He said, well, if this guy's any example, then I can understand what the oracle said. This guy thinks he knows something when he doesn't. I know I don't know anything, and so I'm not misinformed about that. And his view of knowledge tends to be one, has always been this, and Plato took up this view as well, that most of us somehow arrive at a time in our life when we want to know something. And if we treat ourselves with a certain level of intellectual integrity, we'll look at what we think we know and realize it's not up to snuff. And so we've got to work on that. And Socrates apparently got the view that I have to sort of wipe this plate clean and work hard at finding out these important things. But he says most people never get to that point of really wanting to do the introspective work of questioning themselves and questioning their own knowledge and being self-critical. People don't like to be self-critical in a serious way. They will sometimes be in a joshing kind of a way. but in a serious way, people don't like to be self-critical. Socrates believes that's what you got to be. That's the route to knowledge. The route to knowledge is tearing down what you think you know, and then building it up much more carefully and much more completely from what you can show actually is true. But, he says, in that two-step process, he's not burdened with the delusions of knowledge that other people have. So he's ready to learn. He doesn't have to get rid of or purge himself of falsity. He's already sort of down to zero. Now he craves to be filled up with real knowledge. Unfortunately, people he is meeting now think they have real knowledge and don't. And so, if he cares at all about them, he thinks, and this is really what he believes he is doing in his naivete, he believes people would be grateful to him for him showing them how ignorant they are, and doing it in a public place so everybody else can see too. Again, that's just something of a wonderfully innocent, naive point of view, but he did believe he was providing a service to them. He thought that these are people who they'll thank me later, so to speak. Although he really, I think, sort of wanted to be thanked at that time as well. But nobody seemed to understand that this was something that that was in their best interest. They thought what was in their best interest is to keep the illusion of knowledge, even though it had no substance to it, because that made them popular, made them famous, got them elected, so to speak. Lots of different ways in which having the illusion of knowledge can get you a lot of terms in the Senate. And so that's yeah.
How did he do that? Because I think after the third or fourth person that he did that to, he realized that people weren't enjoying what he was doing to them in public.
That's a good question, because he went through so many people, all of whom with the same identical thing. One, I don't know anything, and two, I hate you. And you end up with these two things. You haven't dispelled the ignorance, at least, and you've made an enemy. It seems like it's a lose-lose situation for poor old Socks. And he must have just, I'll give you my hint about, it really is a good question, why he didn't say, the hell with this, I'm going to go back to being a stone cutter. At least, the stones don't talk back to me, and these people are as dumb as stones anyway, so, I'm dealing with people, well, anyway. So, but my view is, it comes from the ancient Stoics. A lot of the ancient Stoics, and Stoicism was a philosophical field that really are a philosophical school of thought that blossomed after the death of Socrates. And many of the great Stoics, Chrysippus is probably the one that was most famous, but Seneca, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, yeah. Yeah, from Rome, yeah. These were some of the most famous of the ancient Stoics who came after the time of Socrates. But most of them look back at Socrates as sort of having almost not exactly fathered the movement, but had ideas that were so consistent with the Stoic idea. And a part of the Stoic idea is you just don't want to get upset at things. And if you really have an internal, sort of this internal ballast, this internal orientation to knowing what you're doing is right, and this is what you got to do, then you keep on keeping on. And you have to be able to let the bad opinions of other people just let it fly off your back. You just got to be able to do that. Because if you end up being deflected by the ignorant opinions of others, then you essentially are internalizing the ignorant opinions of others. If you let what people think of you change who you are, and you're pretty sure that they're pretty dumb and you're pretty smart, then you've made a bad trade. That's a bad trade-off. You trade what you know is true about yourself for the stupidity of the masses. And so, it's sort of an elitist point of view. But Socrates believed that you had to be in the world of just really intellectual tree stumps. You just can't become one of them. You've got to keep your orientation toward who you are. I saw a great quote from a person who will, I hope, live forever with great quotes. George Carlin, one of the great American philosophers. Actually, there are two great American philosophers. I think George Carlin was one, and I think Dirty Harry Callahan was the other one. And the one of Dirty Harry that I like is that a man's got to know his limitations. That's something that Socrates could have told everybody he interrogated. You need to know your bleeping limitations. And then pulls that 44 Magnum out from under his tunic and blows him away. But George Carlin's view was the average person is really stupid, and then think that half the people are stupider than him. Just sort of a mathematical commentary on, if you think the average person is pretty stupid, then reflect on the fact that means half of the rest of the world is stupider than him. So on we go. Socrates was sort of maybe at the top of the heap there and hadn't hit the average person yet, and so on we go. After that, I proceeded systematically. Well, after this, I approached another man, one thought wiser than he, and I thought the same thing, and so I came to be disliked both by him and by many others. After that, I proceeded systematic, and I realized to my sorrow and alarm that I was getting unpopular. But I thought I must attach the greatest importance to the God's oracle. So I must go to all those who had any reputation for knowledge to examine its meaning. So he said that it's been, it became sort of a broken record kind of a thing where again and again and again, people who claimed to have knowledge just proved themselves under his cross-examination that nothing at all. He just did not have it, or they did not have it. And by the dog, gentlemen of the jury, I have another sort of a curse, where I must tell you the truth, I experienced something like this. In my investigation of the service of God, I found that those who had the highest reputation were nearly the most deficient, while those who were thought to be inferior were more knowledgeable. And one thing he also says in there is that in doing this, often after he has sort of shown that a person didn't have the knowledge that he claimed he did, and sort of bad feelings erupted a little bit, the bystanders often thought that Socrates himself, because he could prove this guy had no knowledge, must instead have the knowledge. The only way you can prove this guy is ignorant is to have the knowledge that he lacks. But Socrates wants to show, and it's just a simple logical thing, that you don't have to have the knowledge in question to show that the other person's basis of knowledge is flawed. Think of it in terms, and it really is good to think in these kinds of logical terms, of the difference between the structure of an argument and the truth of the premises. You don't have to know anything about the truth of the premises. You don't have to know anything about the subject at all. If you can identify that there are contradictions and flaws in the structure of, let's say, the base of knowledge or the way that knowledge is presented or anything like that, if you can show the structural flaws, you don't have to know the correct answer. You don't have to know anything about the subject at all. All you have to do is show, and that's what he was doing pretty much, showing logical inconsistencies and logical contradictions within any kind of a claim. And it didn't matter whether you had any deep knowledge of the subject. All you had to do was show, as Socrates was showing, that there was a deep contradiction between different, let's say, different tenets or different elements of that particular claim. So people didn't quite understand this difference between structure and content, and so they thought that because he could show that the structure was flawed, he must also know the content. And Socrates never claimed to know the content. Well, this is a part of where he gets this reputation for wisdom again. He got it from the gods, or at least the gods were interpreted by some people as saying that's true, when he said, I don't know anything. And then he also got it from the masses who saw him sort of disassemble the ego and pretenses of famous people, and they said, well, I mean, it must be that Socrates knows it then, because he showed that this guy doesn't know it. And his view, Socrates' view, was no, those are two different things. The understanding the structure, flaws, and strengths of it is a different thing from understanding the truth of premises that go on to make an argument sound. So that's So now we're going to look at the systematic way in which Socrates went through the population of Athens, trying to find out if there was someone wiser than him. Okay, I must give you an account of my journeys, as if they were labors I'd undertaken to prove the oracle irrefutable. After the politicians, he went to all the politicians first, because apparently the politicians, so the squeaky wheel getting the grease kind of a thing, the politicians shouted most loudly about how wise they were. And so he went to them first and found out that they didn't know anything, not a damn one of them. So things don't change much in 2,500 years. After the politicians, I went to the poets, the writers of tragedies and dictograms and others, and so we go to the artsy-craftsy people, the poet folks. And the poet folks, the arty folks, the musical folks, he said, this is a bad lot. And what's interesting is you'll find out, if you read, or any of you end up reading Republic by Plato, that this distrust of arty people, artists, poets, musicians, this kind of distrust has a lot of staying power within Socrates and Plato. And Plato was pretty well going to have them kicked out of the Republic. You can't trust artists and musicians, and there's something pretty bad about them, so let's get rid of them. This is sort of almost a preamble to what happens more completely in Republic, where Socrates here, in this case, goes to all these people, and he says, first of all, they don't know anything about how they create their stuff. He says that most artists or poets or musicians, they just sort of seems to erupt out of them like a gift from the gods or some inborn talent that they have no way of explaining or describing. And for Socrates, if you have any knowledge, you got to be able to describe it. He's talking about some knowledge that we will eventually call later in the semester, propositional knowledge that you can express in some sort of logical form, so that can be examined, looked at, evaluated for truth or falsity. Something pretty straightforward. And he says that's something you can't say about artists and musicians and poets. They're not straightforward at all, and they couldn't explain anything about what they create. He said you ask a bystander, and they know more about the meaning of a poem than the guy who writes it. The guy who writes it doesn't know anything, or the musician about his song, or etc. And so he said, that was a bad start, because these are people who don't even know what the hell they're doing in their profession. But he said, despite this ignorance, they all think they know about these important things, like the nature of justice and the nature of beauty and the nature of courage, etc. Those things, those great things that just because, he says, just because you think you're prominent in one area, you think therefore you have knowledge in all areas. And so when he started talking to these people about the nature of piety and justice, etc., they were no better than the politicians. The problem with that was, in addition, they couldn't explain their art very well. So they were sort of, they're just, it seemed like Socrates is saying that these artist types are just sort of living in some sort of la-la land. An intellectual la-la land.
Now, was this just a theme permeating through Plato's works, or was this something Socrates he also did?
Much more in Plato's work. Much more. Socrates, I think, sort of planted the seed of distrust of art. But his distrust of art had mainly to do with, when it comes right down to it, you have to be able to defend things with rational principles. And there's something almost counter-rational about the creative process, the artistic process. The products of art themselves often are more intuitive than they are, let's say, logical and rational. And even if you have a structured poem, like a sonnet with iambic pentameter and the 14 lines and the rhyme scheme, etc., that would, for Socrates, that would just be sort of window dressing. The content and everything like that would come out of someplace who knows where, and for that, it was not particularly good. Now, what Plato didn't like, particularly about the artists and the musicians, is that in the Republic that he was trying to describe as a place where people would be virtuous because they wanted to be virtuous. In other words, how can you be a good person and be just to one another? And he tried to show that you could create a social structure that would make you want to be virtuous, and want to be just to one another. You didn't have to be forced to do it. So he was hoping he could do that. And in the Republic, he attempted to do that. But he said one of the problems is that when you're trying to do this on a rational basis, and you let people be exposed to music and art and poetry, it undermines the rational. People start, listen to music, they aren't going to listen to their mom and dad anymore, or what, that sort of thing, but overstatement. But it's the kind of thing you've heard yourselves. But the whole thought, there was something subversive about music and poetry and art that encouraged rebellion rather than rational understanding. And so Plato was maybe even worse than Socrates on that. But in this, Socrates is saying, these guys don't know anything. But they think they know, because they're prominent poets and artists, they think they know all about these other great things, and he showed they didn't. Okay, so at about C, a little before D, a little before 22D, finally I went to the craftsman. For as conscious of knowing practically nothing, and I knew that I would find that they had knowledge of many fine things, and in this I was not mistaken, he said. He said it was a relief to find people who actually knew what they were doing. You go to the craftsman, you go to a shipbuilder, and he doesn't say this, I'm using an example. You go to a shipbuilder, I'm an old sailor, you used to have sailboats, love sailboats. You go to a shipbuilder, and a shipbuilder can tell you, what kind of wood is good for the mast, what kind of wood is good for the keel, what kind of, how to season the wood, what should the ratio of mast height to length of waterline be, what kind of sail configuration should you have for this part of the water as opposed to this part, all these things. He can tell you all that kind of great stuff. And so you can learn a lot from a shipbuilder if you want to learn about shipbuilding. But he says they make a mistake. They think that because they know everything about shipbuilding, or farming, or cooking, or whatever the job is that they had, that gives them the right to essentially know about everything. That, well, I know about shipbuilding, therefore I must know about the nature of knowledge, or the nature of justice, or piety, or beauty, or something like that. They think that because they're knowledgeable in one area, that they're knowledgeable in every area. Now, in other locations within the works of Plato, Socrates attributes this a lot to the democracy. But in a democracy, he was, again, not a fan of the democracy at all. In a democracy, you're expected to have an opinion on everything. I mean, that's what it is. It's all about you voting your opinion. And eventually it came to the point where people didn't really want to go to the trouble of having good opinions. They just realized nobody's going to check their opinion. It's their opinion. They can be as stupid as they want to, and they get the same number of votes as somebody smart. And so, why take the trouble to be smart? You be stupid and you still get to participate, and maybe even get elected to public office. Maybe not just maybe, certainly. But, so Socrates was an enemy of democracy because it encouraged intellectual laziness. And it became the idea that you didn't have to account for your ignorance to be a member of a democracy. You just had to be a citizen.
I know that Plato advocated for a philosopher king and
Oh yes, and he was the greatest man that ever lived by realizing that philosophers should be kings.
Well, did Socrates, I believe, along the same lines? What did Socrates advocate for?
Oh yeah, Socrates believed pretty much the same thing.
That there should be definitely a government for philosophers here.
Oh yeah. Of the philosophers, by the philosophers, and for the philosophers. Maybe I should tell you why. Because I can see the looks on some faces that this sounds like a preposterous thing. Or else it's something like, well, of course, a philosopher would say that because he wants power. Actually, the reason Socrates and Plato held the view that philosophers should be kings, or that, actually, Plato said philosophers should be kings, he said that in the Republic, but Socrates said things like that all through his life. It was that, first of all, democracy is government of the morons, by the morons, and for the morons. So there has to be an alternative. Unfortunately, the alternatives that were available in those days was a government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. Well, that sounds sort of familiar. Rich, moron. Okay. Government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich, or government of the military, by the military, for the military. And his view was that each of these groups had a desire to further their own groups or their own individuals' well-being. And in fact, when we get to Machiavelli, he'll say it in much clearer terms. He says, the poor people of the lower class, they want to gang up to make certain that people in the upper class don't screw them over. And the people in the upper class just want to screw over the poor people. That's all they want to do. So he says, you got to find a way as a prince not to alienate the people who are rich, because they're sort of the source of your money, but you just can't let them screw over the poor people, because the poor people are going to be, what you need to be essentially served. You need to serve them as a prince. And so this whole view of sort of class warfare has been around for a long time, and it's still around today. I think it's sort of been badmouthed by some people, but I do think it's a legitimate form of political and social analysis. What Socrates wanted was to have a group of intellectuals who Now, Plato called it philosopher kings because he felt that you could only trust philosophers because philosophers, one, didn't want to get rich. They didn't really want power. In fact, you said anybody who wants power should be, Plato said, anybody who wants power should be disqualified from ever having power. I mean, that's just, that should be a red flag that goes off saying, here's a person who wants power, they want power for all kinds of sick reasons. It might be enriching themselves or it might be because of some warping of their character. But he says, people who are so dedicated to the intellectual life don't want power. They just want to be left alone so they can think and figure stuff out. He says, you know, that's one of the great things you can do is to figure stuff out on a social basis, on a political basis, on a large-scale basis. So philosophers ought to be the ones to figure stuff out because they're not going to figure things out so they end up better. They're going to sort of shrink from the idea that, oh, I got power, I think I'll order myself a couple of Ferraris. They're only going to want to say, here's a problem, let's think about it, see if we can figure it out. And not think about it in terms of see if we can figure it out so I'll become famous, or see if we can figure it out so my relatives can get rich, or see if we can figure it out so I can get some poontang. Nothing like that. Philosophers are only interested in thinking it through, figuring it out, and making the world better because of their thought. So Socrates thought, that's what we need. Well, there weren't going to be many people wanting to be philosophers, particularly when philosophers were treated like trash in the way they were in Athens, being, you know, people, things in the heaven and none of the earth and stuff like that. So there would be a small cadre of people who are dedicated to being philosophers in the face of opposition by most of the people. He said, these are the people who have to rule because they don't have any desire to rule. They have the intellectual capacity to do it better than anyone else. And they alone can be trusted with people's money and with anybody else for that matter. So that was the view, a long sidebar about what we must.
Then you run headlong into a bit of a paradox.
He thinks that he thought that all known governments at the time were paradoxes.
Well, but yeah, if you have a censor where, you know, only people who do not desire the philosophers, who do not desire to rule,
Yeah.
then you have possibly the drive to become philosophers, and then these philosophers aren't shunned by the people. Then you've got a.
But the problem is that the drive to become a philosopher can really be stunted quickly when you actually become a philosopher. And in two ways. One is that being a philosopher is hard work. And you got to read some boring crap, and you got to do a lot of it. And pretty soon people say, hey, if I become a philosopher, that means I'll become a king. Let me become a philosopher. And pretty soon you find out, one, that either philosophy is hard work. We just sort of already discovered that in the first exam. But either one, the philosophy is hard work. Or two, you may end up sort of being converted to actually being a philosopher and not actually have the desire to rule. You really have the desire to be a philosopher, and you have to be pushed onto the throne by everybody else.
So, but the fact was, like, by the point, if you went to, like, to become a king because you wanted to become a philosopher, it's that. By the time you got there, in serving your own purposes, you were serving as a philosopher, and already you'd be helping, I guess, the government.
Yeah, it would be inevitable.
Yeah.
Yeah, there would be a certain kind of inevitability that he felt would guarantee good rule. So anyway, the craftsmen didn't know anything either, but they build damn good ships, and they can make a souffle that won't fall. So at about 23A, let's continue on, and we'll get through a little bit. 23A. As a result of this investigation, gentlemen of the jury, I acquired much unpopularity of a kind that's hard to deal with. It's a heavy burden. Many slanders came from these people, and a reputation for wisdom. For in each case, the bystanders thought that I myself possessed the wisdom that I proved my interlocutor did not have. What is probable, gentlemen, is that in fact, the God is wise, and that his oracular response meant human wisdom is worth little or nothing. So he is now trying to understand sort of deeper into the meaning of no one is wiser than Socrates. And because he believes this will give him maybe a certain amount of peace and a certain amount of understanding of what maybe God has some message for him that's embedded in the no one is wiser than Socrates. So as he's now looking more or less more deeply into this. This is, one of the first things he comes up with. After having gone through most of Athens, talking to people, trying to find someone wiser than him and failing to do so. So here's what he says, that human wisdom was worth little or nothing. No. In other words, what humans think is wise is worthless. I mean, if what everybody he talked to thought was wisdom, it wasn't worth it. John Nance Garner was a vice president of the United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I think the first of FDR's terms, John Nance Garner, who had been a representative from Texas, House of Representatives, was put on the balance of ticket. FDR was from New York and spoke with a really aristocratic kind of accent. And Cactus Jack Garner, as it was called, John Nance Garner, was sort of a coarse Texan, or is a redundancy. And so he was once asked after he served one term as vice president, somebody else said, asked about what the vice presidency was like, and his famous quote is that being vice president is worth about a bucket of warm piss. Just let you know that your government in action. So that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. It's worth a bucket of warm piss. That's what the oracle said. And when he says this man Socrates, he is using my name as an example. As if he said, this man among you mortals is wisest, who like Socrates understands that his wisdom is worthless. So his interpretation is that Apollo is not saying, you alone, Socrates, are the wisest. He is merely saying that you are a good example of the kind of humility you need to have, the lack of pretension about your own knowledge, that the source of knowledge comes from a lack of your own pretensions to knowledge. And once you're able to dispel those delusions that you have, then you can take the next step to knowledge. And he says, Socrates, you're one of those who has done that. Maybe not the only one, but it's sort of saying that, at least he is interpreting, Socrates is interpreting Apollo as saying, you can all become Socrates. You may not be Socrates now, but you can become a Socrates. If you become a Socrates, no one's going to be wiser than you. You may not know anything, but you have taken the first step to eventually knowing by sort of dispelling yourself of the arrogant assumption that all the knowledge you have right now is all you need. I've had an experience not just in this school, but particularly in this school, which is the place I've taught for the last 13 years, that far too many people, young or old, but particularly young people, come to school thinking that they know everything they need to know, and all they need is a degree so they can get a job. They're not here to learn anything because, of course, their knowledge is perfect. They know enough. Just don't bother me with trying to teach me anything. Just give me a good grade so I can get my degree and go off and get a good job or whatever it is I want to get. Thinking that their knowledge is complete and finished and perfect at this point, so don't confuse me with something that's contrary to what I think is true. And I think philosophy is one of those great things that does disturb you. I hope we're supposed to be disturbers of the peace. So if you're peaceful here, I hope I give you heartburn by the end of the semester. If I haven't done my job. But of course, it could be the food that gives you the heartburn. So who knows? I'll bring in some bacon.
Maybe it's the bad jokes.
Huh?
So maybe it's the bad jokes.
What's a bad joke? Every
It's giving
joke
us
I've ever
heartburn.
told is a bad joke. At least
that's
in
what's
the hands of this class it is.
But the bad jokes are there because John.
I figured that, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, either just got through work or you just got up and had a real bad hangover. And, either way, I got to try to have it light and we dance around and do things like that. Okay, so we now go around this investigation as the god bade me. And that's an important thing. He saw this as Apollo not just saying, Socrates, no one is wiser than you and you can all become Socrates. Socrates undertook this as a sort of not exactly a challenge from the god, but almost a commission from the god of saying, if you can convince enough people to become like you, which is to say not to become a philosopher, just to become questioning of their own knowledge, and being willing to be open about the fact that maybe they don't know what they think they know. If you can just convince enough people to do that, you can turn lives around, you can turn people around, you can turn the city around. Socrates is interpreting at that, to sort of at the core of what the God is saying. The God is now saying, Socrates, you've got a great talent here. You don't know it yet, but you have the talent for asking questions, analyzing logically what people believe, and not being afraid to talk back to it. This is something you can be a useful person in doing this. You can go one-to-one to people, and maybe with a few of them you'll start to teach them the necessity for dispelling the old things they thought they knew, which are unsupportable and unsubstantiated, and come up with something a little better, to sort of sweep clean the contaminated minds and open them up to something better. And so he sees this as him almost a mission, you might say, because it is the God, so he sees this almost as a religious crusade of some sort or another, where it comes from his belief that Apollo, first of all, has authority over his life, and second of all, that Apollo knows specifically what needs to be done to make things better in this world, and Socrates can be an avenue, not the only avenue, but he can be a starting point for turning lives around, making Athens a better place, making the people of Athens a better place. And so he lays that out as sort of what he thinks as the reason he's going about doing what he is doing. He also hopes this will help people understand that the early accusations were false, that he is a different kind of philosopher than Anaxagoras or Anaximander or Thales or any of those old ones, and that the idea of making the worst argument appear stronger merely comes out of his unwillingness to accept bad arguments from people and showing that their bad arguments are bad. And he hopes that at the very least he will have opened a few minds by this little digression into his autobiography, in order that perhaps they'll be open enough when the actual charges are read and debated, that he'll have at least something of a chance to get an acquittal. I want to just say one more thing about corrupting the young, because when we get down, and we'll start at 24B8 is where corrupting the young, where the new charges come in. There's something that you wouldn't have known about as far as the charge of corrupting the young is, there's something personal about this. That Socrates, of course, was known to have students, and sometimes students who were quite young would be sent by their parents to come and learn with Socrates. And Socrates was not a child molester or anything like that. Socrates was a person of great character. But he occasionally had students who were not of great character. And his most famous ungreat character student was a man named Alcibiades. Alcibiades was the greatest traitor in the history of Athens. But he came and studied as a teenage boy with Socrates and sort of got a crush on him. And Socrates, it is claimed, this is a story that comes out, and actually Xenophon says this, Socrates was sort of a flirt. Now, first of all, it was a common thing in those days for older males and younger males to sort of bond and sometimes physically couple, but sort of almost sort of a tutorship, sort of a mentorship, yeah. But the mentorship often got to the physical level as well. And Socrates, according to Xenophon, recognized that in order to attract students, he had to at least give off the impression that he would go as far as he needed to go with these people in order to make certain they would stay his students and learn and stuff like that. And there was this wonderful time, and Alcibiades was a self-promoter. He was an arrogant but brilliant, reckless, erratic, I don't know. Today you'd think he'd probably own meth, but I guess he wasn't in those days. But he was out and became a war hero in the Peloponnesian War, but then he did some reckless things in the Peloponnesian War that got him fired as a general, And then when he got fired as a general, he said, well, piss on Athens, where he'd been born and raised. He went to the enemy side, Sparta, and fought for Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. So he fought on both sides, and he got to be a general for Sparta. Also, it is said that he seduced the wife. Sparta had several kings who sort of ruled like a triumvirate. He seduced the wife of one of the kings when the king was away fighting the Peloponnesian War, and impregnated her, and insisted that the baby be named after her, even though she still stayed married after him, even though she still stayed married to the king. Really, a rascal. One of the things that Xenophon said, that when he was young, he seduced older men, and when he was old, he seduced younger women. He got everybody. But Alcibiades is depicted in one of the great works of Plato called Symposium as a, yes, Lisa?
I was just thinking, why do you think he said he lived in great poverty because of his service to the god?
Why do you think he did live in great poverty?
Yeah, he said that he did.
Yeah. Well, part of it is that he didn't feel as if material goods were that important. Although, interesting thing, he'll mention his poverty often enough that you wonder if he's not a little resentful of his poverty. But he at least publicly seems to think that, and he gives off the impression that material well-being for him is not important. And, but he does find it very useful to have other people pay his bills. So, and he hung out with a lot of rich people. Plato came from a very rich family, and Plato probably essentially underwrote his whole life. And so he could afford to put on the air of poverty because behind the scenes, Plato was paying for everything. So he can protest about, I've made nothing off my teaching. I'm a poor man walking around in rags, but Plato was paying the bills, frankly. So that is sort of an issue. So Alcibiades, in this great work called Symposium, really one of the greatest works by Plato. Symposium is investigating, as I said before when we talked about the things you find in dialogues with Socrates. In it is sort of a search for definition. Well, this is a search for the definition of love. And it has to do with male, male, female, female, heterosexual, metrosexual, bromance, every kind of thing, every kind of love you want. It's there. And what happens is each of the participants, so both male and female participants in the thing, had to create on the spot sort of a song, a big, long, romantic narrative about the meaning of love to them. And Alcibiades, when he gets up, he's a little drunk, maybe more than a little drunk. And a part of his narrative of love, he starts talking about the time when he and Socrates went to bed. And one of the things he says, and apparently, he would, quite a few sheets to the wind, was that Socrates didn't really want to have any sex with him at all. He just wanted to roll over and go back to, go to sleep. And he was, he said it was like sleeping with my brother. He got no action at all that night. And he was really disappointed that Socrates, after sort of being I guess, a little flirtatious with him, didn't want to do anything at all. Really didn't want a physical relationship. He just wanted to keep Alcibiades around so he could teach him a little more. And Alcibiades wanted to, get a little action. So Alcibiades, in his little song that he gives in Symposium, sort of reveals a few interesting things. Now, of course, it may just be fiction. It may just be Plato wishing he were Alcibiades, or who knows what. So it was an interesting story. But when the charge of corrupting the youth comes up, everybody knows, first of all, Alcibiades, had the hots for Socrates. Alcibiades was a student of Socrates when he was young. And Alcibiades was a traitor to Athens. You can put a few two and twos together there and say, maybe he was just a poor guy that got corrupted badly by this guy Socrates, and then became a womanizer, a manizer, and a traitor, and a whole lot of other things besides. And so the charge of corrupting the youth, for many people in Athens, had this little sidebar attached, and we know what Alcibiades did, and we know how hot Alcibiades was for that old bastard. So, that could be a part of the corrupting of the youth charge, was people remembering, yeah, I know one youth that got his real corrupted bad. So we'll start there again. I don't know when school opens again. It may be weeks from now after that. the snow apocalypse comes